They make the claim that marriage, not necessarily, they don't go as far as to say marriage in and of itself, but marriage in the church is entirely meant to keep women obedient and a means of maintaining their church membership. Honestly, I really hate this line of reasoning. We're not talking about underage girls here who are being forced into marriage. We're talking about adult women who make their own choices about getting married or not getting married. Sure, a lot of people in our church get married while their age still has a teen in it, right? Maybe 19 years old. And a lot of people in our church get married way younger than their peers, maybe who are outside of the church. The point these podcasters are trying to make is that they don't know enough about their own lives to make their own adult decisions, despite the fact that they're adults. In the United States, an 18-year-old is an adult, and she should be treated like one. That she's allowed to make decisions about her own life, even really big decisions like marriage. Adults, unless they are proven to be incompetent, and that's usually a legal process, unless they are proven to be incompetent, they're expected to take on the responsibility of the decisions that they make for their own lives. Are there scenarios where adult women or men have been pressured into marriages that they didn't want? Certainly. And to say every young woman who gets married in the church is only doing so because she's unable to stand up to some pressure about a major decision in her life that she is unable to make, it's assuming that she is an infant, that she is incapable of deciding what she wants in her life. No, these are adult women able to make their own choices. Do they make choices that are too fast for these podcasters' preference? Absolutely. Do they make choices that for marriage that are maybe faster than their peers in other parts of the country or in other religions? Sure, but it's their choices to make. Just because they're doing this doesn't mean they're doing it because the church is pressuring them into it. We're talking about legal adults here. Segment 4, we're talking about Heaven's Helpline, this podcast from New Zealand. They're billed as a podcast that's talking about how sexual abuse is handled in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We're partway through covering episode 3 of theirs. There's only 6 episodes total, and we still haven't quite gotten exactly to sexual abuse, but we have come to sexual discrimination. They say the church sets up a terrible situation for women, even adult women, because they are so oppressed and discriminated against on the basis of their gender, and that this enables a culture of abuse to happen. So let me talk through their claims about why women are oppressed in this church according to them, and some thoughts on a reasonable way to think about it otherwise. They say that an all-male priesthood is bad in and of itself. The claim is that the church teaches that any action a priesthood holder does is endorsed by the church. That anything, someone who holds the priesthood, a man in our church who has been ordained to the priesthood, anything he does is therefore endorsed by the church. It's kind of laughable, right? Because how in the world could the church be responsible for all of those things? And the church has taught them perfectly well some actions you should not be doing. So the claim that any action that a priesthood-holding man takes is therefore endorsed is a little bit silly. But they're kind of doing this hyperbole to show, it seems like men are really, really, really in charge, and that they themselves are seen as acting for God. That's their words. And so therefore they are treated like God. I don't think he's ever met any Latter-day Saint women. Not very many of the women I know would agree with that that's the culture or the situation that they're living in. And they certainly haven't heard those women disagreeing with any number of things, who have very good minds, very good use of logic, very good ability to argue back when they need to, when things are important. They interview a woman who felt really offended that one time she heard someone ask how many of the priesthood had shown up for a specific event, and that it wasn't important, apparently, that how many women or how many children had shown up, how many priesthood had shown up. And if you're looking from the outside in, you can kind of squint and see why she might be upset about something being said that way, unless you understand that people who hold the priesthood are required for some of the things that we need to do in church. So asking the question, how many people were there who had the priesthood? That might have very well just been a question of, do we have enough people to bless the sacrament? Do we have enough people to pass the sacrament? It's not a men matter and women don't. That's are there people who hold the correct office to fulfill some of the roles that needed to be fulfilled? So you can see sort of this continued lack of nuance of understanding of what is actually going on in our church. Another woman complains that a 13-year-old boy in our church would have more authority than a 40-year-old career woman, that he would be in charge of her, that he would have authority over her. Which is just silly, as if random 13-year-old boys are given any authority over their own mothers or over just random women in the church. They present it as if a professional career woman sitting in the pew and there's a 13-year-old boy on the other side of the church, he gets to tell her what to do. And that is not remotely how it works. That would be completely outside of sort of his line of duty, what he is allowed to be in charge of. Just kind of indicating a lack of understanding of how things actually work here. Another claim they make about how women are treated in this sort of sexist way, it doesn't really make sense, even in how they present it, but I'll tell you what they say. They say that the church discourages women from getting education. Now, the host of the show, actually, to his credit, he does jump in and tries to temper the conversation that's going on among the guests to say, well, like, hold up. Like, they actually do encourage education in everyone, male and female. Everyone should get as much education as they can. But the claim that the guest is making, that women are discouraged from education, it's still taken seriously. They still go on to make the point that they're trying to make. Their point is women are sort of kept dumb so that they don't know what's going on, that they can't understand, that because of this, empathy and understanding of issues in the church that impact women will always be secondary because the women themselves can't articulate the issues as they see them. Again, I would just ask, like, have you ever met a woman in our church? That does not describe any of them that I know, as if they're just these passive women who have no opinions, who just sit around and say, oh yes, everything is just great in my silly little brain. Like, a complete lack of understanding of what women in our church are like, which feels, frankly, kind of offensive. He's trying to defend women in our church and actually is ending up insulting us. So I'm not quite sure what they're doing here. They also go on to say, well, gosh, women are taught from a very young age that their purpose and their greatest role in life is to be a mother, to raise their children, and that should be their highest priority. And they use a story to illustrate why, in their opinion, this is bad. So they tell a story of a girl who she got a scholarship to BYU, Hawaii, but her father was rather abusive. He actually kicks her out of the house right before she's supposed to leave for school. She is not able to leave for school. She can't kind of financially support herself. She is unable to go to school. Later, she reconciles with her father. She moves back into the home of her parents and decides herself it is not the right time in her life to go to school. She decides not to do it. Her proof of why the church disvalues women's education is that her father kicked her out of her house. Without also weighing that against, the church gave her a scholarship to go to BYU Hawaii. The church, acting in its official position, was putting like money towards her education. It's super sad that her and her father were having such conflict. He sounds very violent. It does not sound like they were living in a good home. It's very sad that he kicked her out. But that is an action he is taking contrary to the exact thing the church was trying to do in this girl's life, which was give her an education. And yet they are using this as proof that the church does not value education for women. They make the claim that marriage, not necessarily, they don't go as far as to say marriage in and of itself, but marriage in the church is entirely meant to keep women obedient and a means of maintaining their church membership. Honestly, I really hate this line of reasoning. We're not talking about underage girls here who are being forced into marriage. We're talking about adult women who make their own choices about getting married or not getting married. Sure. A lot of people in our church get married while their age still has a teen in it, like maybe 19 years old. And a lot of people in our church get married way younger than their peers, maybe who are outside of the church. The point these podcasters are trying to make is that they don't know enough about their own lives to make their own adult decisions, despite the fact that they're adults. In the United States, an 18-year-old is an adult, and she should be treated like one, that she's allowed to make decisions about her own life, even really big decisions like marriage. Adults, unless they are proven to be incompetent, and that's usually a legal process, unless they are proven to be incompetent, they're expected to take on the responsibility of the decisions that they make for their own lives. Are there scenarios where adult women or men have been pressured into marriages that they didn't want? Certainly. And to say every young woman who gets married in the church is only doing so because she's unable to stand up to some pressure about a major decision in her life that she is unable to make, it's assuming that she is an infant, that she is incapable of deciding what she wants in her life. No, these are adult women able to make their own choices. Do they make choices that are too fast for these podcasters' preference? Absolutely. Do they make choices that for marriage that are maybe faster than their peers in other parts of the country or in other religions? Sure, but it's their choices to make. Just because they're doing this doesn't mean they're doing it because the church is pressuring them into it. We're talking about legal adults here. They tell a story of a woman who, I've mentioned her a couple times, she prayed, she felt like she got a spiritual prompting that she should marry this man. She later regrets the marriage, believes that this was spiritual abuse of some kind, encouraging young people to get married. They also make the claim that using kind of spiritual language, or they call it spiritual energy, that using that is a common practice to sort of manipulate people in the church. That this boy who proposes to her, that he was using a wave of spiritual energy on her as if it was like some spell, and that somehow that's like something the church taught him to do. It really is offensive to adult women who actually can make choices in their own life. I get that her story was hard and her marriage sounds incredibly, incredibly difficult. I hope that she is well and thriving and happy today. But the church didn't teach her then boyfriend how to hypnotize her with spiritual energy and to trick her into marrying him. Their next point about how the church is kind of sexually prejudiced against women is that the church used to have a line in the temple about women promising to obey their husband, and the claim is this is an unusual and abusive practice. That line isn't used in the same way in the temple anymore. I have been endowed for 5 years. I've never heard it in the temple. I don't know when it was taken out, but it was taken out before I ever came into the church. So language changes as the population changes, as dynamics change. That's not something that we say in the temple anymore. Nevertheless, they claim this is an abusive practice as if it is one unique to our church, that promising obedience to a husband was just so reprehensible. How could this possibly stand? Protestants, Catholics, Orthodox Christians, people of other non-Christian faiths have had the concept in marriage ceremonies all around the world at all points in history until really rather recently. It's in my lifetime that ever started to slip out of marriage ceremonies. This isn't a Latter-day Saint tradition that a woman promised to obey her husband. That is a global human tradition. I get it that the line doesn't sound right to modern ears anymore, but how is that a LDS problem specifically? Like, they really want to pin that on here's proof that these people are bad because this is their practice, without looking at the entire context of like, this is the history of marriage. I have links in the footnotes if you want to read some articles on the history of marriage and this phrase in particular in marriage ceremonies. Their next claim about women is that most men in the church are terrible, controlling, they're awful to their wives, and that the church enables this. I would like to see any official teaching from the church that enables this. I'd like to see any conference talk that has said, oh, hey, husbands, why don't you be awful to your wives? To pretend that this is a teaching of the church, it's so incredibly offensive. I get it, this is their opinion, but they're claiming that our church teaches something that it does not teach. Have there been men who are members of our church who are terrible to their wives? Sure, but not because the church taught them to do so. So they're kind of mixing some correlation and causation here. It's really, really sloppy logic, in my opinion. Along this line, that men are these terribly abusive people. They tell the story of a woman who had been married to a man who was very, very controlling. He wouldn't let her out of his sight for a moment. When she would go to Relief Society, he would want a full breakdown of everyone she talked to and exactly what she told them. It was not a good marriage for her. She had all kinds of controlling restrictions put on her that were terrible and awful. She was not in a great marriage. Her own story, this is born in episode 3, her branch president, who now is a former member, but at the time was her branch president and describes himself as a very faithful member, he notices that something is wrong, that something is up with her, and he reaches out to her to find out if he can help. He wants to intervene. Like, her own story is, I was in a bad marriage and the church reached out to me to help. But because her husband was a member of the church, therefore this is used as proof of church bad. Her husband, in this scenario, she goes on and tells her story. Her husband kind of continues to be a jerk, despite the fact that her branch president is trying to support her. She attempts suicide. It's incredibly sad. This woman was in a really, really, really bad situation with her husband. The church tried to do the right thing for her. They tried to help in her situation. She goes back after the suicide attempt to her branch president. He supports her. He tells her, whatever you decide to do about your marriage, like, we are here for you. He drives her to a women's shelter, and eventually he buys her a plane ticket with church funds so that she can fly away from the area where she is living and get away from her husband. That branch president, they interview him on the show. He's now a former member, and he's very conflicted because he says, yes, I was absolutely a complete believing member at the time. I was 100% on board with everything about the church. I was doing my duty to help this woman out, to support her. The part where he's mad is that he didn't correctly use funds to buy her this plane ticket, and he was held to some accountability over that, and he thinks that is nonsense. He tries to spin it as he got in trouble for being supportive of her, and that's his story. That's what he says happened, but that it does not match with the experience I have had, or maybe you have had, that a bishop or branch president would get in trouble for trying to support one of the members in his congregation. He might get in trouble for spending money in ways that aren't authorized, but not for trying to be supportive. This former member, he actually kind of goes on to leave the church over this and decides, yes, this is proof the church is really, really bad for women. The reprimand that he received, he can't separate it from actions that he did, perhaps in a wrong procedural way, and his support of her. The same woman goes on to continue telling her story. Before she left her husband for good, they end up moving to another ward. The leadership of that ward is also trying to support them. This is a couple that's clearly in crisis. Her husband is very manipulative. Her husband is kind of the classic charming narcissist. He's grooming not only her, but grooming the community around her. The quote, the podcast host says, Caroline's husband was clearly some kind of psychopath, hyper intelligent and manipulative with absolutely zero empathy. And that's on him, not the Mormon church. So even the host of this show is able to separate, this guy is really bad, not the church's fault. So despite what his guests are doing, he's trying at least to bring a tiny bit of tempering, like credit where credit is due for him. When this woman and her husband, they temporarily move to this other ward, and the ward leaders there are kind of manipulated. They're kind of tricked by her husband. He acts like this great, charming guy, like a lot of abusers do, and the people around him kind of fall for it. And that's upsetting that happens, and that is part of what allows abuse to happen. Abusers are charming and manipulative, and that is what it is. It's true that way inside the church, and outside of the church it's not right, but it shouldn't be surprising that an abuser is also able to manipulate people he is not abusing. So she becomes very mad that some of the leaders in the ward where they were temporarily kind of fell for his act, that they thought he was a good guy. It's sad. It's awful. My heart goes out to that woman. She probably felt very, very alone, probably felt a little bit betrayed by that. But that's an abuse dynamic, not an LDS dynamic. It is not fair to blame that on the church or what the church teaches. That has nothing to do with the church. That has to do with the dynamics that happen in abuse. That's their thoughts on why the church sets up a situation where sexual abuse can happen by starting with being generally abusive to women because of their gender, just in a wide sweeping church practice. I don't see that they have made their case. I see they've made a lot of claims based on some truth and then slightly skewed out of context to try and make a point that the logic does not follow. They set out to make a case that this is what the church is doing. I don't see them making it. In the next section, we're going to go on to talk about where they're actually getting into talking about abuse. And their premise is the church is wrong because how it handles abuse, and it handles abuse in favor of abusers, not victims, as a matter of policy, that this is not a bug, it's the plan, and that is their claim. And we'll examine those claims, see if there is any truth in what they're saying, not just truth in the facts, but truth in their conclusions. So come in for the next episode and we'll talk about that.